Marcus Williams, a single black father barely making ends meet, finds a lost lottery ticket worth millions. What should have been a ticket to freedom becomes a source of fear as racial prejudice, rumors, and threats spread throughout his small town. As the pressure mounts and enemies close in, Marcus and his daughter must navigate the dangerous consequences of their hidden fortune, knowing that revealing the truth could change or destroy their lives forever. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Marcus Williams moved through life in the shadows, blending into the backdrop of his small, nondescript town. His days were marked by the clock-in and clock-out monotony of the factory floor, where the hum of machines was the only constant in a life that had been anything but predictable. As the factory's only black worker, he felt the unspoken stares more than he saw them. No one said it out loud, but he knew. They always knew. The weight of their assumptions pressed against him like an invisible chain, dragging him down into an abyss of silence. The shifts were grueling, but they weren't what kept Marcus awake at night. It was Ella, his 15-year-old daughter, and the gnawing fear that he wasn't enough for her anymore. After Rachel's sudden passing 3 years ago, he had poured everything he had into keeping their lives stitched together, but cracks had started to show. Ella had grown distant, not just from him, but from the world. She was smart, too smart for the small-minded town they lived in, but her brightness was being dulled by the subtle, persistent prejudice she faced every day at school. Teachers assumed less of her. Peers whispered behind her back, and Marcus could see the toll it was taking, even if she didn't talk about it. On his way home from yet another exhausting shift, Marcus found himself walking slower than usual. The late evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows on the sidewalk as the familiar weight of his tired body set in. His thoughts lingered on the stack of unpaid bills waiting for him at home, each one a stark reminder that his paycheck was never enough. Between rent, groceries, and trying to save for Ella's future, there was little left to breathe with. As he neared his apartment, something caught his eye. A piece of paper, fluttering weakly in the wind, barely noticeable. Marcus almost passed it by, but something, a flicker of curiosity or maybe just a reflex, made him stop. He bent down to pick it up. A crumpled, dirty lottery ticket. Worthless, he thought as he stuffed it into his jacket pocket, not bothering to check the numbers. Just another thing someone had tossed aside without a second thought. When he stepped into their cramped two-bedroom apartment, the familiar smell of leftover spaghetti greeted him. Ella sat at the kitchen table, her attention divided between her phone and an open textbook. She barely glanced up when Marcus walked in. "Hey, Dad," she mumbled, her eyes drifting back to the screen. "Hey, kiddo," Marcus replied, forcing a smile despite the exhaustion tugging at him. "How was school?" "Fine." Her voice was distant, disconnected. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with unspoken things that neither of them knew how to address. Marcus knew she was struggling, but every time he tried to talk to her about it, the conversation fell flat. It was like there was an invisible wall between them, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't break through. Sighing, Marcus sat down at the table across from Ella. "I got a call from your teacher today. She said you haven't been turning in your assignments." Ella tensed, her fingers tightening around her phone. "I've been busy." "Busy with what?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his tone even. He didn't want to sound like he was nagging her, but the stress of it all was starting to wear him down. "You know your grades are important. We talked about this." Ella shrugged, her eyes still glued to her screen. "It doesn't matter. It's not like anyone expects me to do well anyway." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He leaned forward, his voice softening. "Ella, don't say that. You're smart. Smarter than anyone else in that school. Don't let them make you think you're less than that." She finally looked up, her eyes tired and guarded. "It's not just school, Dad. It's everything. People look at me and see what they want to see. They don't care who I really am." Marcus knew that feeling all too well. He saw it every day, in the way his coworkers avoided eye contact, in the subtle ways they tried to remind him that he didn't belong. But hearing it from Ella made his heart ache in a way he couldn't put into words. He wanted to fix it, to shield her from the ugliness of the world, but he didn't know how. He sat back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. "I know it's hard, Ella. I know it feels like the whole world's against you sometimes. But you can't let it stop you. You have to keep pushing forward, no matter what." Ella didn't respond. She just stared at him for a moment, her expression unreadable, before turning her attention back to her phone. The conversation was over before it had even really begun. That night, after Ella had gone to bed, Marcus found himself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the pile of bills in front of him. He picked up one envelope after another, his stomach sinking with each overdue notice. How was he supposed to keep up with everything? How was he supposed to give Ella the life she deserved when he couldn't even keep the lights on? Frustrated, Marcus shoved the bills aside and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out the crumpled lottery ticket he had found earlier. He unfolded it, smoothing out the wrinkles with his thumb. It was probably expired or worthless, but on a whim, he grabbed his phone and opened up the lottery app to check the numbers. His heart nearly stopped when he saw the results. The numbers on the ticket matched the winning numbers, every single one. For a moment, Marcus just stared at the screen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. It couldn't be real. There had to be some kind of mistake. But as he double-checked the numbers, the reality began to sink in. He had won. The ticket was worth millions. Marcus's hands trembled as he set the phone down on the table. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of disbelief, excitement, and, oddly enough, fear. What did this mean? What would happen now? His first instinct was to tell Ella, but something stopped him. He wasn't sure why, but a feeling of dread settled over him, whispering that this newfound wealth wasn't the blessing it seemed. People like him didn't come into money without consequences. For weeks, Marcus kept the lottery ticket hidden away, buried under old receipts and forgotten papers in the back of a kitchen drawer. He tried to convince himself that he was just being cautious, that he needed time to think about what to do. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was scared. Scared of what the money would mean for him, for Ella, for their lives. It wasn't just about the sudden influx of wealth. It was about everything that came with it. The paranoia had started almost immediately. Everywhere Marcus went, he felt eyes on him. At the factory, it was the quiet looks his coworkers gave him. The way they whispered when they thought he wasn't paying attention. At the grocery store, it was the cashier's lingering glance, the way she hesitated before handing him his change. Maybe it was all in his head, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that people knew that something had changed, that he was on the verge of a windfall they believed didn't belong to him. It wasn't just the paranoia, though. There was something else, something heavier, that weighed on Marcus's mind. The ticket was worth millions, an amount of money he couldn't even begin to wrap his head around. But with that kind of wealth came responsibility. If he claimed it, if he accepted it, he would be thrust into a world he had never been a part of. A world where he would be scrutinized, judged, and targeted. And the fact that he was a black man, in a town where people like him were always under suspicion, only made the stakes higher. He could imagine the questions already. How did a factory worker like Marcus come into so much money? Was he involved in something illegal? Did he cheat? The subtle racism he experienced daily would morph into something much uglier if he were suddenly wealthy. Every day, the ticket weighed on him, a constant reminder of both hope and fear. Ella had started noticing the change in him, though he tried his best to hide it. She wasn't one to pry, but she wasn't blind either. "Is everything okay, Dad?" she asked one evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, the TV playing quietly in the background. "Yeah, everything's fine," Marcus replied, forcing a smile he didn't feel. "Just work stuff? You know how it is." Ella didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes told Marcus she didn't believe him. She had always been perceptive, too smart for her own good. Marcus knew that whatever tension he was carrying was starting to affect her too, and that only made him feel worse. Ella had her own battles to fight. At school, things weren't any easier for her than they were for Marcus at work. She had once been so eager to learn, always asking questions, always challenging herself to do better. But now, Marcus could see the spark in her dimming, dulled by the weight of being constantly underestimated and ostracized. Her teachers never expected much from her. It didn't matter that she was one of the brightest kids in her class. She was black, and in their eyes, that meant she was always a step behind. They treated her like an outsider, assuming she wasn't interested in learning, that she didn't care about her education. Her classmates weren't much better, isolating her in ways that were subtle but painfully obvious. She had few friends, and the ones she did have never really understood what she was going through. Marcus hated seeing her like that, hated that she was facing the same kind of prejudice he had dealt with his entire life. He had hoped for better for her, but the world hadn't changed as much as he had wanted to believe. It was the same fight, just a different battleground. One evening, after another long shift at the factory, Marcus sat down on the couch, trying to relax, but his thoughts kept circling back to the ticket. The money could change everything. It could pay off their debts, give Ella a chance to go to a better school, maybe even allow them to move away from this town where they were always seen as outsiders. The possibilities were endless, but so were the risks. He had told no one about the ticket, not even Jerome, his best friend and one of the few people he trusted. Jerome had always been there for him through the good times and the bad, and Marcus knew he could count on him for anything. But even with Jerome, Marcus hesitated to share the news. It wasn't that he didn't trust him, it was that saying it out loud would make it real, and Marcus wasn't ready for that. But as the days passed, the weight of the secret became too much to bear. One night, after a few beers and a long talk about life's endless disappointments, Marcus finally let it slip. "Jerome," he said, his voice low and cautious, "what would you do if you had a lot of money? Like, more than you could ever spend?" Jerome raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "I'd probably take care of my family first, you know? Make sure they're set for life. After that, who knows?" "Why? You planning on winning the lottery or something?" Marcus laughed nervously, scratching the back of his neck. "Maybe. Hypothetically. Man, if I had that kind of money, I'd be out of here so fast you wouldn't even see me go," Jerome said with a grin. "You know this place don't care about people like us. You get a chance to leave, you take it. No questions asked." Marcus nodded, but Jerome's words only added to the storm brewing inside him. Of course he wanted to leave, wanted to give Ella a better life, but it wasn't that simple. Nothing ever was. Jerome must have noticed the change in Marcus's demeanor because he leaned forward, his grin fading into a more serious expression. "Hey man, you good? You look like you're carrying the world on your shoulders." Marcus hesitated, then let out a long sigh. "I found a lottery ticket. It's worth millions." Jerome blinked, the words taking a moment to register. "Wait, what? You serious?" Marcus nodded, the weight of the admission lifting slightly from his chest. "Yeah. I've been sitting on it for weeks. I don't know what to do." Jerome stared at him in disbelief. "Man, what are you waiting for? Go claim it. This could change your whole life." "That's what I'm afraid of," Marcus said quietly. Jerome frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "This is your chance, Marcus. You and Ella could finally get out of here, start fresh." "I know," Marcus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you know how people are around here. If they find out a black man won that kind of money, you know what they're going to say. You know what they're going to do." Jerome was silent for a moment, then he nodded slowly. "Yeah, I get it. People here don't want to see us win. But that doesn't mean you should let them stop you. You've been working your whole life, man. You deserve this." Marcus wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that the money could be their way out, but the fear was still there, gnawing at him. What if it just makes things worse? Jerome leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Marcus, nothing is going to change unless you take a chance. Yeah, people are going to talk, they're going to judge, but that doesn't mean you should stay stuck in this life just because of them." Marcus knew Jerome was right, but the storm inside him raged on. The fear, the doubt, the uncertainty, it all swirled together, making it impossible for him to see a clear path forward. The lottery ticket was both a blessing and a curse, and no matter what he did, there would be consequences. As he sat there, staring at the table between them, Marcus realized that the money wasn't just about survival, it was about facing the world head-on, no matter how much it pushed back. But was he ready for that? The days after Marcus confided in Jerome were fraught with an unbearable tension that seemed to permeate every aspect of his life. His conversation with Jerome lingered in his mind, as if the weight of the lottery ticket had become even heavier now that someone else knew about it. Jerome had been right. He couldn't let fear keep him chained to the life he was living. And yet, the thought of taking the leap filled him with dread. As he lay in bed one night, staring up at the cracks in the ceiling, Marcus couldn't stop his mind from spinning. The lottery ticket was still hidden in the drawer beneath a pile of old papers, untouched since the day he had first checked the numbers. It was as if the ticket had grown roots, anchoring him in a limbo between hope and fear. He wanted to believe that the money could solve everything, but experience had taught him that nothing came without strings attached. Then there was Ella. Over the past few weeks, Marcus had noticed the shift in her more than ever. She had always been a quiet kid, but recently she'd retreated even further into herself. The spark that once fueled her ambition had dimmed, replaced by a sullen detachment. He tried to reach her, but every attempt seemed to push her further away. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table in their usual silence, Ella finally broke the quiet. "Dad, is something wrong?" Her voice was soft, but her eyes were sharp, studying him as if she could see the turmoil roiling beneath the surface. Marcus looked up from his plate, startled by the directness of her question. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain everything? The fear, the anxiety, the overwhelming sense that no matter what he did, it wouldn't be enough. "I'm fine, Ella," he said after a moment, forcing a weak smile. "Just a lot on my mind." Ella's gaze didn't waver. "It's more than that. You've been acting different lately. Distant." Marcus sighed, setting his fork down and rubbing his temples. He couldn't lie to her anymore. She deserved to know the truth, or at least part of it. "There's something I've been trying to figure out," he admitted, his voice low. "Something big, and I'm not sure what to do about it." Ella frowned, clearly confused. "What kind of something?" Marcus hesitated, debating how much to tell her. He didn't want to burden her with the full weight of the situation, but at the same time, keeping her in the dark wasn't fair. She was old enough to understand, and maybe, just maybe, talking to her about it would help him find clarity. "I found a lottery ticket," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's worth a lot of money, more than I ever imagined. But I haven't claimed it." Ella blinked, her expression shifting from confusion to shock. "What? Why not?" Marcus ran a hand through his hair, trying to find the right words. "It's complicated, Ella. This kind of money, it changes everything. And not always for the better. People will look at us differently, they'll ask questions, they'll make assumptions." Ella stared at him for a long moment, clearly trying to process what he was saying. "So? You're afraid of what people will think?" "It's not just that," Marcus said, his voice tightening. "You know how things are here. People like us. When we come into money, when we get something good, people don't like it. They'll start questioning how we got it. They'll say we don't deserve it." Ella's brow furrowed, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "But who cares what they think? We've worked hard our whole lives, Dad. We deserve something good. You deserve something good." Marcus looked at her, his heart aching at the determination in her voice. She was right, of course. They had both been through so much, and the idea of finally having something to hold on to was tantalizing. But it wasn't just about them. It was about the world they lived in, a world that didn't always treat people like them kindly. "I'm scared, Ella," Marcus admitted, his voice trembling. "I'm scared that if we take this money, it'll bring more trouble than it's worth." Ella's eyes softened, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, she reached across the table and took his hand. "Dad, you've always told me to be brave, to face the world no matter how hard it is. Maybe it's time for you to take your own advice." Her words hit Marcus like a wave, crashing over him with a force he hadn't expected. He had spent so much of his life trying to shield Ella from the world's harsh realities that he hadn't realized she had grown strong enough to face them on her own. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to stop living in fear. Later that night, Marcus found himself sitting at the kitchen table, staring down at the lottery ticket in his hands. He had memorized the numbers by now, could recite them in his sleep. The ticket felt heavier than it should have, like it was made of lead instead of paper. As he sat there, turning the ticket over in his fingers, a knock at the door startled him. His heart jumped in his chest as he glanced at the clock. It was late, too late for visitors. His mind raced, thinking of all the worst-case scenarios. Had someone found out about the ticket? Was someone coming to take it from him? Marcus stood up slowly, his nerves on edge as he walked to the door and peered through the peephole. His stomach sank when he saw Harold, his next-door neighbor, standing on the other side. Harold wasn't exactly friendly. In fact, he had a reputation for being nosy and judgmental, always sticking his nose where it didn't belong. Taking a deep breath, Marcus opened the door, forcing a polite smile. "Hey, Harold, what can I do for you?" Harold smiled, but there was something off about it, something calculating. "Evening, Marcus. Sorry to bother you this late, but I was just wondering. You haven't, by any chance, heard about that big lottery winner, have you?" Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He tried to keep his face neutral, but his mind was racing. How did Harold know? Was it just a coincidence, or had word gotten out somehow? "I heard something about it," Marcus said carefully, keeping his voice steady. "Why do you ask?" Harold chuckled, leaning against the doorframe. "Well, rumor has it that someone around here might be holding on to a winning ticket. Thought I'd ask around, just in case." Marcus swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He could feel the tension building in his chest, the paranoia creeping back in. Harold's eyes were too sharp, too focused, like he was searching for something in Marcus's expression. "Can't say I know anything about that," Marcus replied, forcing a shrug. "I don't pay much attention to the lottery." Harold's smile tightened, but he didn't push the issue any further. "Well, if you happen to hear anything, let me know. Wouldn't want someone to miss out on their big break, now would we?" Marcus nodded, offering a tight smile of his own. "Sure thing, Harold. Have a good night." As Harold walked away, Marcus closed the door, his mind spinning. The encounter had rattled him more than he wanted to admit. Was it just a coincidence? Or had someone tipped Harold off? The paranoia that had been gnawing at him for weeks flared up again, stronger than ever. He couldn't sit on the ticket forever. It was only a matter of time before someone found out, before the rumors spread even further. The thought of claiming the prize had always been terrifying, but now it felt like his only option. The storm was closing in, and he had to make a decision before it was too late. Marcus woke up the next morning with a sense of dread hanging over him, heavier than ever before. The conversation with Harold the night before had left him shaken, more aware than ever that his secret was becoming harder to keep. The walls were closing in, and each passing day only seemed to tighten the noose around his neck. He could no longer afford to sit idly by, hoping that things would sort themselves out. He had to make a choice, and soon. The factory felt different that day, colder and more unwelcoming than usual. The rhythmic clatter of machines and the steady hum of the production line usually provided Marcus with a strange kind of solace. But today, the noise grated on him, each sound sharpening his anxiety. His coworkers' glances felt more pointed, more suspicious. Had Harold said something to them? Was the rumor spreading, inching closer to the truth? Marcus couldn't focus. His hands fumbled with the equipment, and the repetitive tasks that had become second nature to him now felt foreign and clumsy. His supervisor, Mr. Dawson, a middle-aged man with a stiff, no-nonsense demeanor, noticed his mistakes almost immediately. "Marcus!" Mr. Dawson barked over the din of the machines. "What's going on with you today? You're slower than usual." "Sorry," Marcus muttered, forcing himself to concentrate. "Just distracted, I guess." "Distracted doesn't get the job done," Mr. Dawson snapped. "You keep this up, and we're going to have to talk about your hours." It was a veiled threat, but Marcus had heard it before. Dawson had always seemed to enjoy reminding Marcus of how replaceable he was, using the same thinly veiled threats to keep him in line. It was another reminder of his place, of the fragility of his position in a world that viewed him as expendable. Marcus clenched his jaw and nodded, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. But no matter how hard he tried, the anxiety gnawing at him refused to subside. The factory felt suffocating, the weight of the ticket in his mind pressing harder with each passing hour. By the end of his shift, Marcus was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. He left the factory with his head down, avoiding eye contact with his coworkers as he made his way to the parking lot. All he wanted was to go home, to retreat into the safety of his apartment and shut the world out. But as soon as he stepped through the door, the atmosphere in the apartment felt thick with tension. Ella was sitting on the couch, her textbooks spread out in front of her, but her face was pale, her eyes wide, with a mixture of fear and frustration. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to talk." Marcus's heart sank. "What's wrong?" Ella hesitated, looking down at her hands before speaking. "I overheard something today. At school." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "What did you hear?" "Some of the kids were talking about the lottery winner," she said quietly. They said it was someone from around here, and they were saying things about you." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. "What were they saying?" Ella's eyes flicked up to meet his, and he could see the worry in them. "They think it's you, Dad. They think you're the one who won." For a moment, Marcus couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in on him, and his mind raced with 1,000 possibilities. How had this happened? How had the rumor spread so quickly? He had been so careful, hadn't told anyone outside of Jerome, and yet, somehow, the truth, or at least part of it, was leaking out. "Ella, I didn't think anyone knew," Marcus stammered, his voice shaky. Ella stood up, crossing the room to stand in front of him. "I don't know how they found out, but it's out there. People are talking, and they're saying things that aren't good." Marcus swallowed hard, the full weight of the situation crashing down on him. "What kind of things?" "They're saying you don't deserve it," Ella said, her voice filled with anger. "That you must have stolen the ticket or cheated somehow. They're saying things about us, about who we are." Marcus felt a surge of frustration and helplessness rise in his chest. Of course they were saying that. Of course, the assumption was that if he had something good, something valuable, it had to have been through some dishonest means. It didn't matter that he'd worked hard his whole life, that he'd struggled and sacrificed for years to give Ella a chance at a better future. In their eyes, he wasn't deserving of anything beyond what they deemed acceptable. "I knew this would happen," Marcus muttered, pacing the room as his thoughts spiraled. "I knew people would react like this." Ella watched him, her expression a mix of worry and determination. "Dad, we can't just let them say these things. We can't let them keep us from what's ours." "It's not that simple, Ella," Marcus said, his voice tinged with frustration. "You don't know how people around here can be. They won't just talk, they'll act. They'll make our lives miserable if they think we've gotten something they don't think we deserve." Ella crossed her arms, her jaw set in defiance. "So what? We just sit here and let them take it from us? Let them make us feel small? You've taught me my whole life not to back down from people like that. Why are you backing down now?" Marcus stopped pacing, staring at his daughter. She was right, of course. He had spent years teaching her to stand up for herself, to not let the world's prejudice and ignorance define her. But now, faced with the reality of what they were up against, the fear of what might happen if they claimed the money was paralyzing him. "I don't want to lose everything," Marcus said quietly, his voice breaking. "I don't want to put you in danger." "You're not going to lose me, Dad," Ella said, stepping closer and placing a hand on his arm. "We'll face this together. We always have. But we can't keep living like this, scared and hiding. We deserve better than that." Her words hit Marcus like a wave, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a small flicker of hope. She was right. They did deserve better. And if claiming the lottery ticket meant facing the world's judgment and prejudice, then so be it. They couldn't keep living in fear, hiding from the opportunities they had earned. Later that night, Marcus sat alone at the kitchen table, staring down at the lottery ticket in his hands. The fear was still there, gnawing at him, but now it was tempered by something stronger: determination. Ella had given him the strength to face what lay ahead, and he knew, deep down, that they could handle whatever came their way. But just as Marcus was beginning to feel a sense of resolve, the phone rang. The sudden sound startled him, and for a moment he hesitated before picking it up. "Hello?" he answered cautiously. There was a pause on the other end, and then a familiar voice came through. "Marcus, it's Jerome." Marcus's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Hey, Jerome, what's up?" Jerome's voice was tense, a far cry from his usual easygoing demeanor. "I've been hearing things, man. People are talking about you, about the lottery ticket. I think you need to be careful." Marcus's stomach tightened. "I know. Ella told me. It's spreading faster than I thought." "Yeah, it's bad," Jerome said, his voice low. "Harold's been running his mouth all over town. People are starting to ask questions, and it's not going to take long before they start coming for you." Marcus felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. "Coming for me? What do you mean?" "I mean, this town doesn't take kindly to people like us getting ahead," Jerome said grimly. "They're going to find any excuse to come after you, to discredit you, to make sure you don't get what's yours." Marcus clenched his fist around the phone. He had known this was a possibility, but hearing it out loud made it feel more real, more dangerous. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. The storm was coming, and he needed to be ready for it. "Thanks for the heads up, Jerome," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I'll be careful." "You better be," Jerome replied. "And Marcus, don't let them take this from you. You've earned it." As Marcus hung up the phone, his mind was made up. He would claim the ticket. He would take what was his, no matter what the town thought or said. The breaking point had come, and Marcus was ready to face whatever consequences awaited him. The morning sun streamed through the blinds, casting long shadows across the kitchen as Marcus sat at the table, the lottery ticket in front of him. For weeks, it had been nothing more than a piece of paper, a source of anxiety and fear. But now, it was a symbol of his decision, his choice to stand up for what was his. The weight that had been pressing down on him for so long seemed to lift, just slightly, as if taking the step forward had given him a glimpse of a future he had almost stopped believing in. Ella came into the kitchen, her hair still messy from sleep, but there was a look of determination on her face that mirrored his own. Without saying a word, she sat down across from him, her eyes flicking to the lottery ticket. "Today's the day, huh?" she asked softly. "Yeah," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "Today's the day." They had talked late into the night after Marcus's phone call with Jerome. Ella had been clear. She wasn't afraid. She believed in him, believed that they could face whatever came their way. And Marcus had realized that, despite everything, he wasn't alone. Ella was his strength, just as he had always tried to be hers. Marcus had done his research. He knew how to claim the ticket anonymously without attracting too much attention. At least, that was the plan. But the truth was, in a town like theirs, word traveled fast. And even if he could remain anonymous to the lottery officials, it was only a matter of time before the rumors caught up with him. As they got ready to leave, Marcus glanced out the window. The neighborhood was quiet, but he couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on them, watching, waiting. Harold's house loomed across the street, the blinds half drawn, but Marcus knew he was in there, probably already stirring up more trouble. The drive to the lottery office felt longer than it should have. Marcus's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing with thoughts of what might happen next. Would people start showing up at their door? Would they accuse him of something he hadn't done? He tried to push the thoughts away, focusing instead on Ella beside him, her calm presence grounding him in the moment. When they finally pulled into the parking lot, Marcus took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned to Ella, who gave him a reassuring nod. "Whatever happens," she said, "we're in this together." Marcus nodded, feeling a swell of pride and gratitude for his daughter. They walked into the lottery office together, the small, that sterile room feeling strangely surreal after everything they'd been through. The clerk behind the counter barely glanced up as Marcus slid the ticket across the counter, his hands trembling slightly. "I'd like to claim this," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. The clerk's eyes widened as she glanced at the numbers, quickly realizing what was in front of her. She tapped at the keyboard, her demeanor shifting as she processed the claim. It was happening. The money, the chance for a better life, was within reach. But even as the process unfolded, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the real challenge was yet to come. The next few days were a blur. The money, or at least the confirmation of it, was real. Marcus had taken every precaution he could, setting up an anonymous trust, following the advice of the financial advisors the lottery office had connected him with. On paper, nothing had changed. But Marcus could feel the shift in the air. The news had spread, and the town was buzzing with rumors. Whispers followed him wherever he went, at the grocery store, at the gas station, even at Ella's school. It didn't take long for Harold to make his move. One afternoon, just as Marcus was stepping outside to grab the mail, Harold was there, leaning against his porch railing, with a smug smile on his face. "So it's true then," Harold said, his voice dripping with barely concealed contempt. "You really are the winner." Marcus tensed, but forced himself to stay calm. "Not sure what you're talking about, Harold." "Oh, come on," Harold sneered, stepping closer. "Everyone knows by now. You think you can just walk away with all that money, no questions asked? You think people aren't going to wonder how someone like you got so lucky?" Marcus clenched his fists, feeling the anger rise in his chest. But he knew better than to let Harold get under his skin. He had dealt with men like Harold his whole life. Men who couldn't stand to see someone like Marcus succeed, who saw every step forward Marcus took as a threat to their own fragile sense of superiority. "I didn't steal anything, Harold," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I found the ticket fair and square. I played the game like everyone else." Harold laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. Sure, but you and I both know that people around here aren't going to buy that story. They're going to think you did something shady, and when they start digging, well, who knows what they'll find." Marcus felt a surge of frustration, but before he could respond, Ella appeared behind him, her eyes blazing with anger. "Leave us alone, Harold," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We're not going to let you push us around just because you can't stand the idea of someone else having something you don't." Harold's smirk faltered, and for a moment, Marcus thought he saw a flicker of uncertainty in the man's eyes. But then Harold straightened up, his expression hardening once again. "You think this town's going to stand by and watch while you two get rich?" Harold said, his voice low and threatening. "We'll see about that." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Marcus and Elding on the porch, the weight of his words hanging in the air. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of what Harold had said. The truth was, Harold was right. The town wouldn't stand by and watch. The people who had always looked down on him, who had assumed the worst of him simply because of who he was, weren't going to let him enjoy his newfound wealth and peace. But as Marcus lay there, he realized something else. He didn't care. For too long, Marcus had lived in fear of what people would say, of what they would do, of the judgments and the assumptions. But the truth was, they had always judged him. They had always assumed the worst, no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he tried to fit in. The lottery ticket hadn't changed that. It had only made it more obvious. The next morning, Marcus made a decision. He wasn't going to let the town's prejudice define him anymore. He wasn't going to live in fear of what people thought or said. He had spent too long letting the world tell him what he could and couldn't have, what he deserved, and what he didn't. But now, for the first time in his life, Marcus was going to take control. He sat down with Ella at the kitchen table, a sense of calm settling over him. "We're leaving," Marcus said simply. Ella looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're done with this place," Marcus said. "We're going to start fresh, somewhere new, somewhere where people don't look at us and see what they want to see." Ella stared at him for a moment, then slowly nodded. "Where will we go?" "Anywhere," Marcus said with a smile. "Anywhere we want." The process of leaving wasn't easy. There were loose ends to tie up, papers to sign, and the inevitable goodbyes to the few people in town who had been kind to them. Jerome had been understanding, supportive as always, though there had been a tinge of sadness in his voice when he wished them well. As the days passed, Marcus felt lighter. The weight of the town's judgment, of the years of prejudice and struggle, began to lift. For the first time in a long time, he could see a future. One where he and Ella weren't defined by the small-mindedness of those around them. Karma had a funny way of working itself out, Marcus thought. Harold, who had been so intent on tearing them down, had his own troubles to deal with now. Rumor had it that he was under investigation for some shady dealings of his own, something about unpaid taxes and questionable business practices. It seemed that Harold had been so busy watching Marcus that he hadn't noticed the cracks forming in his own life. And as for Marcus and Ella, they left the town behind with no regrets. The road ahead was wide open, full of possibilities. The world wasn't perfect, and Marcus knew that prejudice would follow them wherever they went. But now, with the lottery money in hand and a renewed sense of purpose, they had the power to build something better. A life where they were free to define themselves, where no one could take their worth away from them. As they drove out of town for the last time, Marcus glanced over at Ella, who was staring out the window, her expression thoughtful but hopeful. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" she asked quietly. Marcus smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. "Yeah, kiddo. We're gonna be just fine." The road stretched out before them, endless and full of promise, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt ready for whatever came next. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.